The assembly rooms at Hartlow smelled of beeswax and hothouse roses, and Eleanor Voss stood just inside the door in shoes that had been mended so many times the cobbler had begun refusing her custom out of what he called professional embarrassment. She had polished them until midnight. She had rubbed the toes with a rag soaked in lamp black until her fingers ached, and still the left sole showed a seam where the leather had cracked and been sewn shut again, and still the right heel sat a fraction lower than its partner, worn down by 2 years of walking to the vicarage and back with her mending basket on her arm. She kept her skirts an inch longer than the fashion allowed, in the hope that a few extra inches of muslin might do what polish could not. It did not fool anyone who looked, and everyone in Hartlow's better parlors had, by now, learned precisely where to look. The room around her was doing what such rooms always did in autumn. Candles multiplied in the long mirrors until the light seemed to come from everywhere at once. The orchestra tuning somewhere behind a bank of hothouse roses too dear for the season. Silk moving past silk in colors, Eleanor could no longer afford to dye a ribbon, let alone a gown. She had worn the same dove gray to 4 assemblies running. She had stopped counting how many times. Lady Prynne looked. She always looked, and she made certain that looking was audible. "The shoe-worn widow has come again," she said to her daughter, behind a fan opened only halfway, in the particular murmur that was pitched to carry exactly as far as it was meant to. "One does admire the persistence." Camilla Prynne laughed the small, practiced laugh of a girl who had been taught that laughing at the right moment was itself an accomplishment. Eleanor did not turn her head. She had learned, in 18 months of widowhood, that turning her head only confirmed she had heard, and confirming she had heard only invited more. She crossed the room instead with her shoulders set, past the card tables and the knot of officers' wives comparing new bonnets, past a footman balancing a tray of ratafia she did not take, and found the small window alcove where the light fell least, because a woman who could not command the room's admiration could at least command where in it she stood. She found her aunt near the refreshment table. Beatrice settled in her usual chair with her cane hooked over one wrist, and her eyes already narrowed at Lady Prynne across the room, and Eleanor sat beside her, and did not look at her own feet again, and told herself, as she had told herself at every assembly since Thomas died, that a room full of silk and candlelight could not actually take anything from her that she had not already lost at sea. "You ought not to have come," Beatrice said quietly, not unkindly, watching the fan still moving at Lady Prynne's wrist. "I could have told the vicar's wife you had a chill." "I have told enough lies to this parish about the state of things," Eleanor said. "I will not add a chill to the list." Her aunt patted her hand once and said nothing further, and the orchestra began the first set, and neither of them rose to dance. It was in the middle of that thought, with the orchestra tuning and Lady Prynne's voice still faintly ringing in her ears, that she became aware of a stillness near the terrace doors, a man standing alone with the particular quality of someone who had not come to dance. She did not yet know his name. She only knew that he was watching the room the way she watched it herself, from the edges, cataloging exits. 18 months earlier, Lieutenant Thomas Voss had gone down with his ship off the Portuguese coast, and Eleanor had gone, within the space of a single letter, from the wife of a rising officer to a widow with £11 a year and a cottage she rented from a landlord who raised the price each Michaelmas. She had a small aunt, Beatrice Wren, spare and sharp-tongued and loyal past all reason, who had come to live with her rather than see her manage alone. She had a brass compass that had belonged to Thomas, its glass scratched, its needle still true, which she kept in the bottom of her work-basket and touched sometimes without meaning to, the way one touches a bruise to confirm it is still there. She had her needle. Hartlow's better families paid her, quietly and through intermediaries, to turn hems and darn linens and let out bodices before a confinement, work that kept the cottage's small fire burning and never once appeared on any invitation. She did it well. Her stitches were so fine that Mrs. Thorne, the vicar's wife, had once mistaken a mended cuff for an unmended one and complimented the linen draper on his cloth. She kept a wooden box beside her chair with 3 sizes of needle sorted by length, a stub of beeswax for her thread, and a thimble worn smooth on the inside from use, and she worked most evenings by a single candle, because 2 candles cost more than the mending itself sometimes earned. She did it because there was no other honest way to keep herself and her aunt fed, and she had decided, in the raw first months of her grief, that she would rather be thought poor than be poor and pretend otherwise. The dismissive verdict had settled over her early and had never entirely lifted. To the parish, she was a curiosity, a woman who had married up and then, through no fault anyone could quite name, married down again by the simple mechanism of widowhood. To Lady Prynne, she was something closer to a warning, the visible proof of what happened to a woman without fortune, useful chiefly as an example held up beside Camilla's prospects. Eleanor had stopped expecting the room to think otherwise. She came to the assemblies because her aunt insisted a widow who never showed her face became a widow the parish forgot to feed, and she left as early as courtesy allowed, and in between she practiced the particular skill of being present, without being seen. She did not know, that evening, that the man at the terrace doors already carried her name folded inside his coat, written in a solicitor's careful hand on a paper he had not yet found the occasion to deliver. His name was Julian Ashcombe, the Earl of Rothmere, and he had not attended an assembly in 3 years. He had come to Hartlow on business that had nothing to do with dancing, business concerning the late Admiral Sir Edmund Hale, whose estate Julian had the misfortune and the honor of executing, and whose final instructions had sent him, somewhat against his own inclination, into a country ballroom he would otherwise have avoided for the rest of his natural life. He told himself he had come only to confirm an address. He stood at the terrace doors for the better part of an hour, and found that he had not once looked toward the address in question, a Mrs. Voss, without some part of him rearranging its plans. She did not preen. That was the first thing he noticed, and the thing that kept him noticing. In a room built entirely from display, from turned shoulders and angled fans and the careful choreography of being seen to advantage, she sat with her hands folded and her chin level and made no attempt whatsoever to be looked at. When Lady Prynne's voice reached her, something moved briefly at the corner of her mouth, gone before it could be called a wince, and then nothing. She simply continued sitting, upright, unmoved, in shoes that had clearly been mended by someone who could not afford new ones, and had decided the mending would be neat regardless. He had buried a wife who cared a great deal what was seen, and a son who had never lived long enough to care about anything. And in the 3 years since, anyone who watched him closely would have noticed how quickly he had learned to tell real steadiness from its performance at 20 paces. Nothing in the woman by the refreshment table read as performance. He did not introduce himself that night. He watched her leave early, on her aunt's arm, without a carriage, walking the half-mile home along the lane in the dark because £11 a year did not extend to hired transport, and something in his chest, long since disciplined into stillness, moved for the first time in longer than he cared to count. The following week he learned, from the parish clerk, that Mrs. Voss took in mending for half of Hartlow's genteel households, that her husband had served under Admiral Hale himself some years before his death, and that the widow had never once, in 18 months, applied to the parish for relief. He learned this and said nothing to anyone. And he began, without entirely admitting to himself that he had begun anything, to find reasons to be in places where she also happened to be. He found her first at the vicarage, on a gray Tuesday, mending the vicar's wife's second-best gown, while a housemaid named Hannah stood accused, in the vicarage kitchen, of stealing a silver thimble. "It was on the dresser Sunday last," Mrs. Thorne was saying, her voice pitched for the whole kitchen. "And it is not on the dresser now. And I should like an honest answer before dinner, Hannah, if you please." Hannah, 17 and pale, twisted her apron in both hands and said only that she had not touched it. In the flat, frightened voice of someone who has learned that protesting too much only looks worse, Eleanor set down her needle without a word, crossed to the dresser, knelt without regard for her own skirts, and drew the thimble out from behind the flour bin, where it had rolled. She said, most likely on Sunday when the bin was last moved for the baking. She did not scold Mrs. Thorne for the accusation. She simply placed the thimble in the vicar's wife's palm and returned to her chair and her needle as though she had done nothing more than pick up a dropped glove. No reproach, no triumph, simply the plain fact restored to its place. Mrs. Thorne had the grace to color and to tell Hannah she was sorry for the fright. Hannah had not thanked Eleanor aloud. She had only looked at her, once, on her way back to the scullery, the way a person looks at someone who has, without any fuss at all, refused to let an injustice stand. Julian, arriving to consult the vicar on parish business, and left waiting in the passage, saw the whole of it through a half-open door and said nothing, and carried the sight of it with him back to Rothmere Hall like a coin he did not yet know what to spend. The second voicing of the label came a fortnight later, at church, in full daylight, with half the parish still filing out onto the green. Lady Prynne, catching sight of Eleanor's shoes on the porch steps, did not trouble to lower her voice at all. "Really, Mrs. Voss, one begins to wonder if the shoe is a matter of principle," she said, to general and uncomfortable laughter, "or simple necessity dressed as one." Eleanor's color rose. She said nothing, which was its own kind of answer, and stepped past into the lane. And it was there, at the bottom of the church steps, that Julian fell into pace beside her without any preamble at all. "Take my arm," he said. It was not offered so much as instructed, the way a man might tell someone to mind a step. The lane is uneven past the smithy. "I have walked this lane 100 times, my lord." "Then you know precisely how uneven it becomes." He did not smile. He simply held his arm where it was until she took it, which she did eventually, with the particular stiffness of a woman unaccustomed to being commanded into her own comfort. He walked her as far as the smithy and no further, released her arm without comment, and said only, "Sit down when you reach home. Eat something warm. You have been standing since morning service, and it shows in your color," before he turned back toward his own carriage, leaving her on the lane with her heart beating in a manner she resented and could not immediately explain. She told her aunt that evening that the Earl of Rothmere was a strange, abrupt sort of man. Beatrice, who had lived considerably longer and noticed considerably more, said nothing at all, and smiled into her tea. At Rothmere Hall, in a study that had not been rearranged in 3 years, a portrait hung turned to the wall beside the window, its frame collecting dust on the reverse side rather than the front. It was of Anne, Julian's wife, painted the year before their marriage. Before the winter, he had insisted she travel to Bath despite the surgeon's caution. Before the roads froze harder than any almanac had predicted. Before the carriage overturned outside Chippenham and took from him, in a single black night, both his wife and the son she had been carrying toward the season of his birth. He had not commanded that journey out of carelessness. He had commanded it because Anne had wished for the waters, and because he had wanted, more than anything, to give her what she wished. And he had let that wanting override the surgeon's word and the ice on the road, and every instinct that had since told him, nightly, that a man who loves carelessly is no better than a man who does not love at all. He had not spoken her name aloud in over a year. He kept, in the drawer of his writing desk, a single folded letter in her hand, the last she had written him, unopened past its first line because he had never once found the courage to read further. What he had learned from losing her was that command without tenderness was cruelty, and tenderness without discipline was catastrophe, and that a man who wished to protect anyone again would have to learn, somehow, to hold both at once. He did not know, watching Eleanor walk home in mended shoes with her chin held level against a room's contempt, that he had already begun relearning it. The solicitor's letter arrived at Rothmere Hall 3 days later, confirming what Julian had already suspected and had been, for reasons he was only beginning to understand, reluctant to act upon. Admiral Sir Edmund Hale, dying childless and without close family, had left the greater part of his modest fortune, and a well-sprung town carriage besides, to one Mrs. Voss, the widow of Lieutenant Thomas Voss, in recognition of a debt the Admiral had considered, in his own words, older than any entail and heavier than any title. Thomas, some 6 years before his own death, had gone overboard in a gale off Gibraltar to pull the Admiral's only son from the water, at cost to his own health that he had never once mentioned to his young wife. The Admiral had not forgotten. He had simply waited, in the manner of proud men, for a means of repayment that would not read as charity, and had found it at last in his will. Julian held the letter for a long while before he set it down. He understood, reading it, precisely what it would mean for a woman who had been mocked on church steps for the state of her shoes to be handed, without warning, a fortune and a carriage before the very people who had mocked her. He understood, too, that he wanted very much to be the one to give it to her gently, rather than have it delivered by a stranger's hand, and that the wanting had very little left in it to do with the Admiral's debt, and a great deal to do with his own. He did not act at once. He told himself he was waiting for the solicitor to finish the transfer papers. In truth, he was watching her, in the weeks that followed, with an attention he had not permitted himself in 3 years. He watched her at the market stall, where she bargained with unhurried dignity over the price of thread, refusing a merchant's attempt to round the sum up in his own favor with nothing more than a level look and a repeated figure, until the man relented rather than argue further with a widow who plainly knew arithmetic better than he did. He watched her at the parish school on Thursday afternoons, where she read aloud from a single worn primer to a room of children who could not otherwise afford a book between them, doing the voices of the wolf and the 3 sisters with a seriousness that made the smallest children shriek with delight, and the schoolmaster, a dour man not given to sentiment, smile despite himself from the doorway. He found himself, more than once, at her own gate at dusk, on his way to nowhere in particular, watching the candle come up in her front window, and telling himself he was merely taking the air. He did not speak to her on any of these occasions. He told himself that watching, unlike calling, committed him to nothing, and knew, even as he told himself so, that it was no longer entirely true. He offered her his carriage twice more in that fortnight, both times in the same low, commanding register, "Come inside, sit down," and both times she refused with the same stubborn dignity, until the third time, caught in a sudden autumn downpour with her mending basket soaked through, she accepted without argument, too tired and too cold to manage her pride as well as the rain. The carriage smelled of leather and rain, and, faintly, of the bergamot he used at his shaving glass, and Eleanor sat with her soaked basket at her feet, and her hands folded too tightly in her lap, acutely aware of the narrowness of the seat, and the warmth of him across from her, and the absurdity of feeling, at 24, as flustered as a girl at her first assembly. "You need not sit as though I intend to bite," Julian said, not quite dryly. "I am told the seats are quite safe. I am not accustomed to fine carriages, my lord. You must forgive my posture." "There is nothing to forgive. I only observe that you hold yourself the same way in a ballroom as you do escaping a storm. I begin to wonder if you ever permit yourself to simply sit." She had no ready answer for that, and so she said nothing, and watched the hedgerows blur past the window instead, and it was several minutes before either of them spoke again. They rode in silence for the better part of a mile after that. It was Eleanor who broke it first, turning her damp bonnet over in her hands. "You have been very odd with me, my lord," she said. "Kind and odd, and I confess I do not know what to make of either." "I am not accustomed to either," he said. "You will have to forgive the execution. I do not require forgiving you anything. I require knowing what you want." He looked at her then, properly, for the first time since the terrace doors, and something in his face, disciplined for 3 years into stillness, nearly gave itself away. "I have not yet decided what I am permitted to want," he said, low, and turned to the window before she could answer. And the carriage carried them the rest of the way to her gate, in a silence that had changed its character entirely. It was Lady Prynne who ended the silence for them, and not gently. She had watched the Earl of Rothmere's carriage stop twice now at a widow's cottage gate, had watched Camilla's careful campaign of the past 2 seasons come to nothing against a woman in mended shoes, and she moved, as women of her particular confidence always move, with the certainty of someone who has never once been publicly wrong. She went first to Mrs. Kellow, who had paid Eleanor to turn her daughter's winter gowns for 3 years running, and suggested, over tea, in the mildest possible language, that a woman who had begun putting herself so forward with a peer of the realm might not be entirely to be trusted with the intimate care of a family's linens. Mrs. Kellow, who valued her standing with Lady Prynne a great deal more than she valued a well-turned hem, sent a note round the following morning, regretting that her daughter's wardrobes were, for the present, complete. A second household, the Farrants, followed within days, with no note at all, only a basket of unfinished mending left silently on Eleanor's step, and no further custom after. Eleanor said nothing of it to her aunt at first. She only worked longer by her single candle, taking in what smaller commissions remained, and told herself that £11 a year had kept them through worse winters than this one would prove to be. Lady Prynne went next to the parish school, and had a word with the schoolmaster about the propriety of a widow reading to other women's children when that widow's own conduct had lately become, she said, a subject of comment. And on the third occasion, immediately before the harvest fair, standing on the church steps with half the parish gathered for the blessing of the crops, she delivered the label a final time, in front of Julian himself, in front of Eleanor's aunt, in front of Hannah the housemaid who had never forgotten the thimble. "I only say what all of Hartlow already thinks," Lady Prynne said, her voice pitched now for the whole green to hear. "A shoe-worn widow does not become a countess by mending her way into a great house's good opinion. Some women were simply not made for carriages, my lord, whatever they may pretend to at church." The green went quiet in the particular way a crowd goes quiet when it has heard something it is ashamed to have enjoyed. Eleanor did not cry. She had promised herself, 18 months ago, over Thomas's empty grave marker, that she would not give any room the satisfaction of her tears, and she held to it now, with her hands folded white at the knuckle, and her chin level, and her ruined shoes planted on the church steps as though they had every right to be there. She was aware, in the long silence that followed, of small sounds that seemed suddenly very loud. A child's cough near the lich gate, the creak of the church door still swinging on its hinge, Hannah's sharp, indrawn breath from somewhere behind her. She was aware of Julian, standing very still at the edge of her vision, his jaw set in a way she had not seen it set before, and she found she did not want him to speak. Not there, not with the whole green watching for exactly that. And so she moved first, gathering her aunt's arm and turning toward the lane before he could. Something in her did break, quietly, in a place no one on the green could see, all the same. She had told herself she wanted nothing from Julian Ashcombe beyond ordinary kindness. Standing there, hearing her poverty laid out as public entertainment in front of him, she understood all at once how much more than kindness she had begun, foolishly, to hope for, and how completely Lady Prynne had just ensured she could never accept it, not without every soul in Hartlow believing she had schemed her way to it. That night she sat a long while at the small table with a single sheet of paper before her, the candle burned down nearly to its dish, and wrote him a short note, which she did not send. She thanked him for his kindness. She asked that he not trouble himself to call again, for both their sakes, and signed it only Mrs. Voss, formally, as though the rain and the carriage and the low, careful things he had said to her had none of them happened at all. She read it over twice, folded it once, and held it a long moment above the candle flame before she let it catch, watching the paper curl black at the corner, and thinking, with a clarity that frightened her, that she had just burned the truest thing she had written in 18 months. She told her aunt only that she intended to decline the Earl's notice from now on, for her own dignity's sake. Dignity, Beatrice said, is a fine thing to eat when the mending money runs short. I would rather starve with my dignity than dine on his pity. It was never pity, child, and you know it as well as I do. Beatrice Wren set down her needlework and looked at her niece a long moment, and did not argue further, though she wept a little after Eleanor had gone to bed, for the particular cruelty of watching pride do the antagonist's work for her, when Lady Prynne's tongue had already done more than enough. Julian did not call the following day, having been given, through the vicar, Eleanor's clear and quiet request that he not. He spent that day instead in his study, with the transfer papers from the solicitor spread across his desk and Anne's turned portrait at his shoulder, and he understood, staring at both, that he had spent 3 years mistaking withdrawal for discipline, and that a man who let a woman's pride and a room's cruelty part him from what he wanted was not being careful. He was only being a coward in a better coat. He thought of Anne's last letter, still folded and unread in his desk drawer, its seal long since broken, but its second half never faced. He took it out that night, for the first time in a year, and set it on the desk before him, and looked at it a long while before he made himself read past the first line at last. It was not a reproach. It was 3 ordinary sentences about the weather in Bath, a complaint about the inn's poor coffee, and her hope of seeing him by Friday, closed with the plain, unremarkable endearment she had used in every letter she had ever sent him. There was no accusation in it anywhere. There was no hint that she had known, riding out into that freezing dusk, that she rode toward anything but an ordinary reunion. The plainness of it undid him more than any accusation could have, because it told him, finally, what he had refused to hear for 3 years, that Anne had never once blamed him, that the blame had been entirely his own invention, built and maintained because a man in grief will always prefer a wound he can control to one that simply happened to him. He sat with the letter a long while, and when he rose from the desk at last, past midnight, he crossed to the window where Anne's portrait stood turned to the wall and rested his hand flat against its blank reverse, not yet ready to turn it, but no longer entirely unwilling either. He did not want to build the same prison around Eleanor's absence. He called at Prynne House the following morning, uninvited and unannounced, and found Lady Prynne in her small parlor over her correspondence. He did not sit. "You will not speak of Mrs. Voss's shoes again," he said without preamble, "on any church step, in any parlor, or at any assembly in this county." Lady Prynne set down her pen with the particular composure of a woman recalculating a hand she had believed already won. I only say what the parish already thinks, my lord. I have done the lady no injury she has not invited by her own forwardness. You have done her an injury I intend to see corrected within the fortnight, and I would rather you heard it from me now than learned it later in company. He held her gaze a moment longer than courtesy required, long enough that something behind her practiced calm shifted, briefly, into the first uncertainty she had allowed herself in years, and then he took his leave without waiting for her reply. She sat a long while after he had gone, her correspondence forgotten, turning over the particular tone he had used, and found, for once, that she could not entirely convince herself she had been in the right. The transfer papers were completed within the week. Julian summoned Mr. Pargeter to Rothmere Hall himself, rather than wait upon the usual post, and laid the matter before him plainly. I want it done at the harvest fair, he said, on the green, before the whole parish, and not 1 day sooner. Mr. Pargeter, a precise man not given to questioning a client's instructions, allowed only that it was an unusual venue for the transfer of a legal bequest. Julian did not explain himself further, and the solicitor, to his credit, did not ask twice. Mr. Pargeter arrived in Hartlow on the Saturday of the harvest fair itself, with the deed of bequest in his case and a new carriage, commissioned to the Admiral's exact instruction, and finished only that autumn, following at a discreet distance behind his gig. The fair filled the green with the whole of the parish, Lady Prynne and Camilla among them, Hannah and the vicar's wife among them, Beatrice seated near the church wall with a basket of apples she had not touched, and Eleanor herself standing near the stalls in her mended shoes, having come only because her aunt had insisted a widow who hid from the fair became a widow, the gossips buried twice. The carriage came up the lane at a walking pace, its lacquer catching the low autumn sun, and the whole green turned to watch it as one body, the way a crowd turns toward anything new and fine. It stopped, not before the church, not before the Prynne's pew box, but directly before Eleanor Voss, and Julian stepped down from his own gig and crossed the green toward her in the particular unhurried stride of a man who has finally stopped weighing consequences. Mr. Pargeter followed with his case, and read aloud, in the flat, unimpeachable voice of a man reading a legal document, the essential lines of Admiral Sir Edmund Hale's final bequest. He read the fortune's sum, which drew an audible breath from more than one stall-keeper. He read the particulars of the carriage, commissioned and finished at the Admiral's own instruction. He read, last and slowest, the debt owed to a lieutenant who had gone into a winter sea off Gibraltar for another man's son and never once spoken of it, not to his commanding officers, not to the Admiralty, not even, it seemed, to his own young wife, until every soul on the green understood exactly whose name stood at the center of that fortune, and exactly how little of pretense had ever attached to it. A murmur went through the crowd, the particular low sound of a great many people revising an opinion at once. Hannah, near the cider stall, put both hands to her mouth. Mrs. Thorne turned to her husband and said something Eleanor did not catch. Beatrice, seated by the church wall, set down her untouched basket of apples and did not trouble to hide that she was crying. Lady Prynne's fan stilled in her hand. She opened her mouth. Once, as though to salvage some remark from the ruin of the last one, glanced toward Camilla as if for rescue, and found for the first time in the memory of anyone present that she had nothing at all to say. Julian did not wait for her to find her words. He stood before Eleanor in the sudden silence the solicitor's reading had left behind, and he did not deliver a speech. He had learned, from 3 years of silence and one unread letter, exactly how much a single honest sentence could carry when a man had earned the right to say it. "The carriage is yours," he said, "as I hope, in time, to be." It was 11 words. It was the only thing he said, and the green, which had gathered that morning expecting apples and ribbon and the ordinary small commerce of a harvest fair, went entirely still around it. Eleanor did not answer him at once. She looked instead at the carriage, and at the solicitor's document still open in his hand, and at Lady Prynne's frozen fan, and last of all at Julian himself, standing before the whole parish, with his hand not quite extended, waiting, the way he had waited 3 years to want anything at all. "You might have told me privately," she said, and her voice shook only a little. "I might have," he agreed. "But you were mocked in this exact place, in front of these exact people, for a poverty that was never the whole truth of you. I did not think the truth should arrive anywhere less public than the lie did." She put her hand in his, then, in her mended shoes, on the green where she had been humbled a dozen times over 18 months, and the crowd that had laughed at her twice began, in ones and twos, to look faintly ashamed of itself. Hannah first, then the vicar's wife, then even 1 or 2 of the families who had withdrawn their mending custom that autumn. Lady Prynne recovered herself enough, eventually, to offer a stiff and general remark about the fineness of the carriage, and to steer Camilla firmly toward the cider stall, her fan working now at twice its former speed. The wedding took place in December, in the same church, with snow beginning on the green as the bells rang. The pews that had once turned to watch her walk in with mended shoes now turned to watch her walk in on her aunt's arm, since Beatrice had flatly refused to be given away by anyone else, and Eleanor wore, beneath a new gown that had not been mended by anyone's hand but the modiste's, a small brass compass on a ribbon at her wrist, its glass still scratched, its needle still true. Hannah stood near the back, with the rest of the household staff invited to witness, and cried without any shame at all through the whole of the register signing. Mrs. Thorne wept as well, rather more discreetly, and told anyone who would listen afterward that she had always said Mrs. Voss was a woman of true quality, a claim no one present troubled to contradict, though several exchanged glances at the sudden certainty of her memory. Lady Prynne attended, as courtesy to the county required, seated 3 pews back with Camilla beside her, and offered at the wedding breakfast a stiff and general remark about being glad to see the matter so satisfactorily resolved, which Eleanor accepted with a courtesy every bit as stiff. And no more was said of shoe-worn widows in Hartlow after that day, though the phrase was remembered in the way small cruelties often are, longer than its author would have liked. Rothmere Hall took the winter well. Fires were kept in every room that had gone cold for 3 years, and the turned portrait in the study was righted at last, cleaned of its dust, and hung where the morning light could reach it, not as a wound kept alive, but as a woman remembered kindly, which Julian found, once he allowed it, was a very different thing. Beatrice came to live at the hall as well, installed in a sunny room near the nursery that stood, for now, quietly ready, and she took to telling anyone who would listen that she had known, from the very first carriage ride in the rain, precisely how the matter would end. Hannah came to the hall that same winter, engaged at Eleanor's particular request as an upper housemaid with wages a full third higher than the vicarage had ever paid her, and settled in below stairs with the unhidden pride of a girl who had once been accused over a thimble, and now kept the keys to a countess's linen press. Mrs. Kellow sent, in January, a stiff little note of good wishes on the marriage, which Eleanor read once, folded neatly, and did not answer, having decided that some doors could be left closed without any cruelty in the closing. On the first snow of that Christmas, Eleanor stood at the tall windows of the hall's east parlor with the brass compass turned over once in her fingers, watching the white come down over grounds that were, at last, entirely her own, to walk in whatever shoes she pleased. The fire had been built up high behind her, and somewhere down the passage Beatrice was instructing a footman, at considerable volume, on the proper way to carry a tea-tray up a staircase, and the sound of it, ordinary and warm, reached the parlor like something Eleanor had not known she was still waiting to hear. Julian came to stand behind her, his hand resting light at her shoulder. And for a moment neither of them said anything at all, watching the snow settle over the drive where a carriage, her carriage, stood waiting under its canvas for whatever errand the new year might ask of it. "I used to think a wound only closed if no one ever mentioned it again," he said at last, quietly, more to the window than to her. "I have since learned it closes faster for being spoken of, now and then, by someone who will not flinch at the hearing." "Then you must tell me of her sometime," Eleanor said. "Properly. Not in fragments." "I will," he said, and meant it. And for the first time in either of their lives, nothing further needed saying to be understood. If Eleanor's carriage ever passed you on a country road, you would not have known from the plain, elegant hands that once held its reins in service to no one's opinion but her own, exactly how far it had traveled to reach her. It had come, in the end, the longest way of all, through worn shoes and a widow's pride, and a cold man's silence, to a woman who had never once asked to be seen, and was, at last, and for good,